Welcome to the StrongTeams.com podcast, where we help leaders build strong teams. Teams built on empathy, understanding, and trust, where every team member feels valued and contributes at the highest level possible.
Welcome to the StrongTeams.com podcast. My name is Steve Neesmith.
And I'm Rodney Cox.
And Rodney, our guest today is Tom Harper. Tom is the publisher of BiblicalLeadership.com and chairman of Networld Media Group. He's written multiple books, including Through Colored Glasses, How Great Leaders Reveal Reality, Leading from the Lion's Den, Leadership Principles from Every Book of the Bible, and his most recent book is Servant Leaders Strong, Uniting Biblical Wisdom and High-Performance Leadership, which we'll talk a little bit about today. Tom, thank you for joining us today on the StrongTeams.com podcast.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Tom, let me add my welcome also, and I'm grateful that you're on our broadcast here today. I can't wait for individuals to hear more about Servant Leaders Strong and a whole lot more about BiblicalLeadership.com. We're grateful that you're here, and I always like to start more on a personal note than a professional note. So, Tom, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit more about you personally? Tell us about your family, kind of where you're located, stuff like that.
Sure. Thanks for having me, guys. I live in Louisville, Kentucky, been married 30 years, have 3 kids. We go to Southeast Christian Church, and I've been there for quite a long time. We were saved, my wife and I, when we were adults in our early 20s, and so we've been at the same church ever since. And I became an elder a few years ago, right before COVID hit, so it's been an adventure, a wild ride. To see behind the scenes what goes on at a mega church, during something like COVID. So, but my son graduated from Southern Seminary, and he wants to be a pastor as soon as the Lord would have him enter a church. And he's 23, and then a middle son who's 20, and a daughter who's 14. So that's the skinny on us.
Yeah, quite the spread, right? A 14 to a 23-year-old. What was up with that?
Well, we ended up adopting after we had 2 biological children.
Oh, that's awesome.
And so that's why there's a bit of a gap between our 20 and our 14. And it took me about 2 or 3 years to come around and join my wife in the decision to adopt. And glad we did. And she was the first girl in the family, the young, first daughter. And so it's been a great eye-opening experience. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I would say that my 2 daughters, 34, 35 now, tame me as a dad, right? I grew up with cousins that were all boys, and, that's all I knew were boys. And boy, when I had little girls, boy, did that change my heart, my mind, my perspective, lots of different things for sure. Yeah. And so tell us a little bit more about your professional journey. You're the founder and publisher of BiblicalLeadership.com. How did you get there?
Well, I really started BiblicalLeadership.com as a ministry passion. And because I'm a business guy, I'm an entrepreneur, I love starting stuff. And it was really born out of a desire to enter ministry that was sort of like frustrated by the Lord. What I mean by that is back in 2000, I went to my wife and I said, "Hey, honey, I think I'd like to go to seminary and possibly go into ministry somehow." And she said, "Okay, wait a minute. We're about to have our first baby. We are, you're starting a new business, Networld Media Group, with investors." And she said, and with my father, my father-in-law has been my partner for 23 years. He passed away a couple of years ago, but she said, you're entering business with my dad. So, one of those things cannot fit. So I decided to stay in business and then reach out and fulfill what I felt was a drawing and a calling to build the kingdom through other means. And one of those means was to start Biblical Leadership, which actually started as ChurchCentral.com years ago. And then I changed the name to broaden the audience to include marketplace leaders about 6 or 7 years ago. And that was BiblicalLeadership.com.
Our stories are so similar, Tom. I had a radical road to Damascus experience after the death of my brother. He passed away at 27 years old, my only sibling, to cancer. And through that radical experience, drew close to the Lord, just couldn't get enough of his word. And I kept going to Elizabeth in the 90s, and I'd say, baby, I really feel like I'm called to be a pastor. Like I need to go back to, school and go to seminary. And we'd pray about it. And she'd come back to me, Tom, and she'd say, honey, I'm just not called to be a pastor's wife. And I'd go, are you listening to the same God I'm listening to? And, we were on our anniversary not long ago, and she asked me how many people we had touched over the years. And I told her, and she said, if you'd have went and pastored the largest church in the country, would you have touched that many people? And it was that point of reality, that our wives bring to us a lot of times, right, as leaders, to say, we can push the door open, we can kick the door open, but when we do that and leave our wives behind, it's probably not God's best for us. And I think that's hard to learn as a leader, how to wait and how to see your wife truly as that suitable helper and the one that can maybe help you discern what God's will is. And waiting on her is so important. Tell it, how does that work out in your relationship?
Well, I mean, the bottom line answer is that it has helped forge 30 years of harmonious marriage. So I learned that lesson the hard way, back in our early married days. And I made some decisions. I made some purchases. This is before we were even believers. And I realized that this was a partnership. We were one. We were not two people like we had been before we were married. And so I think it took me learning the hard way and really stumbling, making poor decisions and making solo decisions before I realized I really needed to tap into my wife's wisdom. And then over the years, really since, she has just proven herself to be so wise. And more than, I would say, just using the word helper, she's been more of a partner in business and church. And she's kind of a filter, when things come in, I need to not like immediately react or decide, but I need to utilize her as a filter. And she has been really, I would say, a secret weapon of my leadership as well throughout my career. And, I would have a bad day and I would run it all past her. And then she would give me some pointers, and she'd also make me feel better about myself so I could go back in the next day, back into the fight with renewed energy and vigor, And so it's helpful having a wise, loving wife.
Amen. I agree. Couldn't agree more. So tell me a little bit more about how you developed such a passion for the topic of leadership. Where'd that passion come from?
Yeah, I think it started right when I started my career. I was a salesperson. My first job was selling collection services. So I would I'd have to make 100 phone calls a day. And out of that number, try to set 10 appointments to go sell them collection services so they could collect their past due pay, your receivables. And that was how I really got started. But I realized I didn't want to do that forever. So then I moved into radio advertising sales. And I realized after a while that I wanted to be in management. I wanted to be in leadership. Because not only was that where the real money was going to be in the long term, but it's where I just felt kind of a draw with my personality. I wasn't as highly charged go-getter type A as all of my colleagues were, who were the other salespeople. So then I left there and went to actually work for my father-in-law because a company came in and bought all the radio stations where I was, split them up, and I had a position that was over 3 or 4 of the stations, and they got split, and I was going to lose my job. So I went ahead and worked for him to work my father-in-law, and he gave me a real entrepreneurial environment. And so I saw an opportunity to start an association in the ATM and banking space. And he was already in that space, and then saw an opportunity to start an association that also sold products. And then I said, hey, I can sell advertising, start a magazine for that industry. There isn't already a magazine. And one thing led to another. And suddenly I was not only like entrepreneurializing the industry with an association and other companies servicing it, and then now media, but I saw an opportunity to lead through the association. And so that's what I started doing. And I realized, I love being at the center hub of an entire vertical marketplace. ATMs are this narrow vertical within banking. And I found that I just was, loving the leadership environment and the ability to lead. I met other guys and men and women that were in the same kind of roles. And I built a board and built committees. And I just was like, man, this is what I'm called to do. And then I saw opportunities just to keep growing as a leader. And I was a voracious learner as well. And I read all kinds of books, just nonstop reader. And that's how I learned leadership. And I would just go and try that out, stumble, make some mistakes, and then learn from it. And that really is what developed a love for leadership, I would say.
Tom, you're also an author, and I'm curious about your latest book, Servant Leader Strong. The title alone is intriguing because some may view that term, that phrase, servant leader, they may view it as synonymous with maybe meek or low key, but you focus on it as a strength, Servant Leader Strong. Can you talk a little bit about it?
I did a Bible study. It's kind of a self-directed Bible study several years ago. And the reason I was doing it, or I guess the focus of it was to look at leadership and, what does leadership look like in the Bible? And I wanted to not just stay within the frame of lead like Jesus and servant leadership from, just looking at Jesus. I want to expand and look at the whole Bible. He's, of course, the perfect servant leader. And so I embarked on this journey and started in Genesis and went all the way through to Revelation and encountered all these great leaders, Moses and David and Jeremiah. I mean, the list just goes on. And I looked at, what were their struggles? What were the principles that they taught and they exemplified? And I tweeted as I went. So I would come across a verse that was a real pithy, short leadership truth, and I would put that in the tweet. I would put the verse address, and then I put what I called a micro devotion, within the same tweet. And I did about 200 or 300 of these over about a 3-year period, and then collected them all, and then separated them into different buckets and topics, and realized that I had a multifaceted look at what the Bible says about leadership. And that's what became the book.
Speaking of the book, Tom, you wrote in your book, I wrote this down. I hope I quoted you correctly. You wrote, "For many years, I struggled to lead in a difficult environment. My colleagues seemed to thrive on conflict. I sure didn't. I tried to be a servant, but I couldn't compete with their charisma and intensity." End quote. I think so many people can relate to that statement, Tom. I know I can. I'm an introvert, and yet I've led for a lot of years of my career. Can you tell us more about your evolution as a leader?
Sure. As you were reading that quote, it brought up the emotions that were behind it when I wrote that. A lot of our leadership learnings are emotional at their core. And so I had about a 10 or 11 year period where I was in a crucible of leadership. I think there's a Joseph Calling book. I think Os Hillman wrote that book. And basically he talks about how Joseph's greatest leadership emerged from his greatest difficulties. His time in, the jail, and his time in Potiphar's house, his time where, he thought he had no future and no hope. And what he was doing was he was being ground down, number one, and forced to be humble. And then he was lifted up by the Lord. And that's the way the Lord really works. And it's how he worked in my life. So I was in about a 10 or 11 year very difficult leadership environment. I had business partners that ground me down. I literally kept a journal of what not to do, how not to lead.
That's a great idea. For many years, I've told my team members, I practiced that and told team members that reported to me how important journaling the good, the bad, and the ugly is.
And I learned a lot from that. And I also learned, there's a verse, Proverbs 25:15, the Message paraphrase says it really well. Patient persistence pierces through indifference. Gentle speech breaks down rigid defenses. Another translation says, gentle words can break a bone, basically. And so what it showed me is that even though my partners who are a generation older than me and much more aggressive, Jack Welchian, if you will, who seemed to be better leaders, even though they were built that way and they were in that old school sort of style, I realized that I could be nothing like them from a style and personality perspective and still be an effective leader. And I saw that some of the mistakes they were making because of their styles and how I could do it much, more differently and gently and still break a bone if necessary or affect change in the company and even in an industry, back to that ATM industry example I was mentioning. So I just really felt like that time of difficulty really molded me and refined me and made me a much, much better leader. So if my partners were sitting around the table right now, I would say, thank you guys. You taught me the hard way and helped me be a better leader than I ever would have been without you.
While we're on the topic of scripture here and you're quoting some scripture, I think it'd be interesting to take a phrase that you write as well in your book. You say that leadership starts inside with God. Can you encourage our listeners today to this fact? Are there any scriptures that are really close to your heart that you hold close, that are steadfast leadership principles that you rely on every day that you might be able to share with our listeners?
Yeah, first I would say, Rodney, that the book of Proverbs is my go-to book. So if I was sitting at my desk, you could see behind me on my credenza, I have an open Bible, and it's usually open to Proverbs. And over 10 to 20 years, I have constantly gone to that book and I found, one little pithy statement, one little verse. And I'm like, I've never seen that before, or I would have read it. I'm reading it with new meaning. And so there's one verse in Proverbs that I will use to answer your question. And that is Proverbs. Actually, this is Psalms. So Psalms and Proverbs are kind of these bookends. You got Proverbs, which is practical living and leading, and Psalms is the encouragement to do so, through a leadership lens. And so on the encouragement side, Psalm 118:8 says, "It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in humans." And to me, that is huge encouragement to just go and lead, but lead with a Holy Spirit view and point of view on the world. So, for example, I made a list of things that God doesn't do. He doesn't lie. He doesn't manipulate. He's not moody. He doesn't forget. He doesn't get irrational. He doesn't stress or get tired or worry or criticize. Now, all those things I just listed are what people do. So we do all those things, and so because he doesn't do those things and people do, I can trust him. He doesn't get moody. He's not going to change on me. He gives me strength and faith and joy and patience and salvation all through his grace. It all comes into me, and I ask him for it. Even before we got on this call, I'm like, Lord, give me the grace to answer whatever questions these guys have, because I don't know what you're going to do through me or through this podcast. And I know that he's done a lot through your ministry. But God has a plan for our lives. That is the true plan. People don't have a true plan. They have plans, but they don't have the real plan. He offers true wisdom. He shows us next steps. He gives us proper perspective. So if I, as a leader, am starting from with him, realizing who he is, what he promises through all those things I just mentioned, just open up the book of Proverbs and look at some of these truths and let him fill you with those truths. And then lead through me is what I pray, Lord. Lead through me. Let me be humble, but let me be courageous. Let me be strong. I love that we both have the word strong in our ministries. I have it in my book title. You've got it in your ministry name, and strong teams. And I just always pray for God to be strong through me, because I feel weak a lot, whether it's I'm tired or I'm moody, all those things that I just listed. And I just have to rely on him to overcome my sinfulness and my tendencies and just to lead through me. That's really what I mean by that.
You also write about the potential of sin being so crippling to leaders. And I'd really like to talk a little bit about that, as we've observed so many public downfalls of Christian leaders in the recent years. So talk a little bit about this crippling factor of sin. I think we know it intuitively as leaders, but talk more practically about it.
Yeah, you're right. It is all around us. It is throughout the church. It is throughout the marketplace. We see Christian leaders fall all the time, and it's just sad, and the natural reaction that we have, that we should have, is, how, Lord, can I prevent my own failures and falling? That's what we all want to be able to do at the end of our lives, to say, Lord, thank you for not letting me fall. That's our goal. That's one of our leadership goals. So Jeremiah 17:9 says, the heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. So we're stuck with our sinful hearts. That's just our nature. And that's one of the reasons we see so much failure in leadership. And yet, back to Genesis, in Genesis chapter 4, verse 7, it says, sin desires to have you, but you must master it, which is kind of a strange verse, because it says, wait a minute, we can master sin even though we have sin natures. And so what I wanted to do as a leader was dive into this dichotomy of sin is everywhere, and yet we must master it in our lives, that it cannot overcome us. And so my question of the word was, how? How do we do that? So I'm going to give you 7 really quick little ways that leaders can fight sin, both sin in themselves and around them. And of course, there's a lot more to each one of these, but I'm just going to give them to you just really quick. The first one is to not look at things you shouldn't. And based on Psalm 101:3, I will set before my eyes no vile thing. So it's just to control what we see, what we're inputting into our eyes, what we're looking at online, social media, just that's the basic first step. Second is, don't let anger control you. It's Psalm 4:4 says, in your anger, do not sin. And so we're able to have some self-control with our anger. We should not let it overwhelm us and therefore overwhelm others around us. So third thing, deny yourself physically. That might be fasting. It might just be what Paul says in Romans 6:12. He says, therefore, don't let sin reign in your body so that you obey its desires. So the things that you shouldn't do, but you want to do, deny yourself that thing. Have some control, self-control. Number 4, don't think about how to satisfy sinful desires that, might be internal and long-term. It says, do not think about how to gratify the desires of the sinful nature, again, in Romans 13. Number 5, and I think this is important, back to our talk about, sin is all around us and leaders are falling all around us. And that the 5th one is, don't think you're exempt because you're a leader. We're not exempt from moral failures, from sin affecting us and taking us down. 1 Timothy, Paul says, Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the worst. So here we have a super apostle admitting he is the worst and chief of sinners. 2 more. So number 6, don't sin just because others do. It might seem okay. Everyone else is doing it. 3 John 11 says, do not imitate what is evil, but what is good. Just a very simple verse. And the last one, don't set yourself up for future regret. And a great verse that talks about that is Romans 6:21 says, what benefit did you reap at that time from the things you are now ashamed of? It's giving us perspective, looking back on life and leadership. Those things result in death, he says. So that's a real quick overview of practical steps, but those really help me, fight the sin in me and really the sin around me as well.
Well, Tom, we love the practical and the tactical here on the strongteams.com podcast. One thing we've talked about before, there's been way too much leadership theory out there and not enough practical, tactical tips. So we always want to make time for that. For our listeners out there, this would be a good place to pause and rewind the last 2-3 minutes of the podcast just to hear that list again and write it down. So thanks for bringing that with you, Tom. As we kind of start to enter the close of our podcast, we always like to ask, especially those that are actively leading organizations. You're the chairman of Networld Media. What are you doing to build and or maintain a strong, unified team and your organization, Tom?
Well, I look at strong teams as starting at the top. So when I go back to what I was telling you about my 11 years of really hard times with my partners, everyone knew we were having conflict. We were like bumping into each other, knocking heads, and our turnover was so high. People didn't want to have anything to do with it. Well, then when our culture calmed down, so to speak, when we had a kind of a much smaller senior executive team, and I brought in a new company president. She and I got along really well. We saw eye to eye, and it became suddenly like a family whose parents get along, and the kids feel comfortable and calm. And that's what happened to our team. We were a small company. I think at the time we might have had 35 employees. And so because there was not all the conflict and tension at the top, there was harmony and there was agreement, and it's not like we didn't have differences, but that made everyone feel like they could just be real. And suddenly our turnover lessened. We were starting to have more wins. Our revenue started growing again. We had stronger teams because they trusted each other. They didn't always have to play politics, and so our strong team was built on strong leadership and leaders at the top. And they saw an example of how that they should work together. All they saw before that was conflict and politicking and, factions. And it was just an unhealthy environment. And so I just love to look at our teams now. And I promoted this company president to be CEO a few months ago. And she's now doing the same thing. She's got people she's pulling up and making into senior leaders, and they've seen her example, and she's leading them the same way and making sure that they are leading well. And we're having people starting to retire from this company after 20 years, and people are having their 20th anniversary. And so it's just great to see how strong teams make for a strong, healthy environment and are the result, I think, of strong leadership.
Wow. Rodney, Tom's been reading our mail or reading our emails back and forth to each other. I can't tell you, Tom, how much we subscribe to those principles. And it's one of the reasons we put together this podcast is to help spread that. So thank you for operating that way as a leader.
Yeah, if I can say one more thing before you close, I just wanted to say that I'm looking forward to having your content on our site, biblicalleadership.com. Rodney, I think I was telling you before we started the podcast that tomorrow, which might be a week, after now, as far as when people see this, but your content is going to start to flow on the site. So I'm looking forward to having you, because obviously our philosophies of leadership and strong teams are very much in line, and even more importantly so under the biblical umbrella. So just wanted to put that plug in.
Yeah, Tom, we're grateful for that opportunity too. We do have a common mindset. There's no doubt about it. Even as I hear you talk, Steve, we hear in the spades right here, right? The difference between relational capital and no relational capital. And we think, Tom, that the greatest capital that a leader can possess, there's no greater capital than relational capital. If you don't have relationship, you don't have anything, because it's through the power of our relationships that our love for each other, our zealous and selfless bent towards each other, our love for each other will cover the multitude of sin that we'll do against each other along the way. We unintentionally hurt each other. We unintentionally misunderstand each other. We unintentionally communicate the wrong things to each other. And we need to have a strong trust and a strong relationship in order to look each other in the eye and say, did you really mean that? And for us to look back and say, no, that's not what I meant. And not let Satan get a foothold in our relationships, but keep them healthy and strong. And we're grateful for the opportunity to be on biblicalleadership.com, Tom. We truly are. I like to close our time by asking this question, because I know there's a million things we've missed. But what is the one thing I should have asked you today, or Steve should have asked you, that we didn't ask you, that you really want our listeners to hear before we close our time?
I would say that it really comes out of what we just talked about, and that's culture. And it also comes out of an episode where you interviewed Mark Miller from Chick-fil-A about culture. They're, very intentional. And I believe I have a somewhat complementary philosophy when it comes to culture. I believe that culture is a result more than it is a thing. And so I mentioned a little bit of that a couple minutes ago, and in a nutshell, what I mean by that is that culture is cumulative and viral. It formulates, it turns into a culture as a result of good leadership, strong relationships, like you were saying, strong teams, good values. Biblical values within the business, strong visionary leadership, strong tactical leadership, a strong mission, a strong vision, and then a strong environment as far as a comfortable, safe environment for people to lead and to make mistakes. And so to me, culture is a result of all those things. And as we mentioned a minute ago, I'm like hyper practical. And so I like to break down, what can I do to make my culture into a biblical culture rather than defining a culture that I want and trying to make it happen. So when I follow biblical principles as a leader and as a team leader, then the culture follows as a result. So that's my philosophy, that, I don't think it differs necessarily from what Mark Miller or Patrick Lencioni or others might say about culture, but to me, it's a slightly different way to look at, different lens of leadership.
Yeah, it's the fruit that's produced out of that, right? It's and that fruit is can either be really good or it can be really bad, and it can hurt you and harm you, or it can give life and sustenance to you. And so, and that's what we're creating as leaders, is one of two things: a very toxic culture, or a culture that is full of love and respect, and where people feel valued, where they feel appreciated, understood, and where they feel like they're contributing at the highest level. And that's what we're pursuing, and that's what you're pursuing. So tell our listeners where they can find you online and where they can buy your book, Servant Leaders Strong.
Sure. That's the book's at Amazon, and probably the two good places to find me. One would be biblicalleadership.com. I post on there, as well as many others. We have about 50 other writers that give us their content: Richard Blackaby and Tom Rayner and Carrie Newhoff and others as well. And then LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn all the time. So if you want to connect with me, feel free to just find me on LinkedIn, and we can connect there.
Well, our guest today has been Tom Harper. Tom, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to give this wisdom, these nuggets of wisdom, to our listeners today. Thank you for being on our podcast.
Thank you, guys. Really enjoyed it.
You can find Tom Harper at biblicalleadership.com. That's biblicalleadership.com. Once again, you can pick up a copy of the book Servant Leader Strong at Amazon. And until we meet again, God bless.